Good morning, everyone, and thanks for having me. My name is Balaji Gopalakrishnan. I head up the AI/ML function supporting personal services research at Vanguard Asset Management. Before I start my presentation, I'd like to take a really quick poll. How many of you have used ChatGPT? So that's almost 95%. It's totally expected. How many of you are leveraging ChatGPT in your organization for solving actual, real business problems? That's more like 15, 20%, right? So it's expected that there'll be this gap because it's not going to be easy to just lift and shift ChatGPT into your business use cases. But there is enormous interest in the industry across all verticals for leveraging generative AI for a lot of different use cases. But I'm sure all of us can agree that that you need to really be very thoughtful in terms of what use cases that you'll be working on, because all companies have limited resources, and Gen AI can be a very expensive technology as well. So really thinking through what are the right bets to make on the use cases that you want to work on with Gen AI is super important. The second one is we really need a scalable technology infrastructure, because there are so many different options when it comes to Gen AI. You have open source models, some absolutely fantastic open source models. You have these great commercial models as well, like GPT-4 and others. And then there's lots of things in between, like vendor solutions and so on. So the technology infrastructure should be able to seamlessly support all of these different solutions, so that AI/ML practitioners can seamlessly sort of stitch some of these solutions together to drive the intended business outcomes. The third one, which perhaps is the most important, is you need a really robust governance process to be able to introduce this technology in a responsible manner. So those are some of the topics that I'll be discussing today. But I'll also go a little bit under the surface on a very popular use case on knowledge management. It's at least definitely very popular in the financial services space. And I'll be talking about some of the key questions that every organization has to really get it right in order to be able to scale knowledge management use cases across the enterprise. So with that, I'm assuming that all of you know what generative AI is. So I'm going to skip the definition part of it and move to this slide over here. Again, what you see over here is not an exhaustive list of models, but just a representative list, just to show two or three things. One, generative AI did not come with the advent of ChatGPT. The AI/ML practitioner community has been using generative AI for quite some time now. In fact, some of you may be familiar with some of the models that I've listed over here, like BERT, GPT-2, as well as some of the more recent models like GPT-Neo and GPT-Neo-J and so on. These are open source models. And you can do a lot of, you can tackle a lot of use cases with these models. And we have been using these types of models for use cases like detecting complaints, but also extracting the reasons for why complaints actually occur. And similarly, on the fraud side, be able to detect fraud and be able to give additional context in terms of where the fraud actually happened. And you can also use these models for generating different variations of emails and things like that. But certainly in the last couple of years, there's been tremendous progress when it comes to the maturity of these models, which essentially lends itself naturally to sort of rehash some of these use cases and get great level of performance and drive adoption through that process. So that's one. Second, if you look at the last column in 2022, you can see that you have these very large models, 1 trillion parameter type of models like ChatGPT and others. And these are generally called generalist models. So these models, behind the scenes, they've been fine-tuned to do a lot of different tasks. They can do document classification, summarization, you can compare documents, you can even do some really good natural language inferencing and content categorization and so on. And that's what amazes us, right? It's a full model that can do a lot of different things. But they are heavy-duty models, very expensive to use. They have their place in terms of where you need to use them. But there are also all the other models. There are very small models like the DQ-BERT and Gato and all of these models, very tiny models, but these can be used for very specific business use cases. And this is very important from a business use standpoint, because ultimately the objective of bringing generative AI in an industry context is to have a very high yield. That is, if you invest in generative AI, you want to get the maximum possible out of that, which means it's important to be able to align these models against your use cases. You want to use the right size models for the right use cases, and sometimes you may actually have to even orchestrate between these different models to drive the right outcomes. So while these large models are great, but there's a lot of choices that you can make. And that also ties back to my original comment when I said we need a really technology infrastructure where you can seamlessly navigate through all of these different types of models. Now, ChatGPT has certainly created a lot of buzz. One of the things, I've been in this AI/ML space for 20 plus years. The one thing that ChatGPT has done that other AI models and sort of transformations has not done is ChatGPT has made generative AI highly accessible to non-AI/ML practitioners in a very tangible and user-friendly manner. So what that has done is people who use it in their private laptop, when they go back to office, they're looking at what is the domain area that they're working on where they can actually apply Gen AI, and they come back with a lot of use cases. So traditionally, AI/ML practitioners always had to go more than halfway to convince business partners to use AI/ML technologies, but now the tables have turned and there is huge demand. Everyone wants to use Gen AI for their favorite business problem. As an AI/ML practitioner, that's super exciting for me, but then I think we have to balance that excitement with the fact that not all of the use cases may be even solvable with generative AI. So I just want to talk a little bit about some of the use cases that we are seeing. And this is not just use cases just at Vanguard, but more broadly. And we saw the presentation by David Wu, where he talked about some of the use cases in the wealth management space. And we saw the IBM presenter talk about a lot of use cases in the banking area as well. So these are just a representative set of use cases. So out of the hundreds of use cases that we are seeing, they tend to sort of naturally cluster into these four broad categories. The first one is knowledge management, which is where we see the center of gravity. Lots of use cases is falling in that category. And what I mean by knowledge management is use cases where you have a knowledge base and somebody wants to ask a question and you want to extract the right answer from that knowledge base. So at a high level, that's what is knowledge management. Then we have code generation, content generation, and chatbots. And these are all not completely distinct clusters. There's definitely some intersection between these clusters for sure. And below them, you see all of these other categories as well that sort of maps to these clusters. One of the most popular use case that we are seeing is the search and summarize use case. This will be like a Q&A system that a frontline worker can use to ask a question against a knowledge base and get an answer that they can quickly transmit to the client. So that way the client satisfaction will go up because they're able to close the loop with the client faster. And it also is going to drive productivity. So the value proposition from this is very tangible. But again, solving this problem is not going to be lift and shift. This is the type of use case that I'm going to double click a little bit in the future slides. And when you look at knowledge management itself, it's not a monolith. There's going to be variations in use case within the knowledge management space. For instance, some of the use cases that we are seeing includes call intelligence as well. So when you ask a question, you need to have the additional context. The client is calling and they're talking about something, and that is resulting in a question, and you're posing that question to the system. It has to understand the context. So the call intelligence and search and summarize is combined together is a more complex knowledge management use case. We see a lot of opportunities in the contract AI space, from contract authoring to redline optimization that can help us turn around contracts much faster. There is a lot of use cases with natural language inferencing. That is, we want to take a contract and be able to see if there are any inherent risks in the contract, and how do you actually pull that out using generative AI. Sales and marketing is another area where it seems like it naturally lends itself to content generation type of generative AI use cases. And it's also slightly lower risk in terms of the data, because you're generating data just based on some prompts. This could be things like creating a first draft of a content with text and images for a sales or marketing brochure, Or it could be around creating a blog post from a video that a senior exec in the company has given to an agency, right, in an instant. And all of these use cases, as I'm describing these things, these are all going to have a human in the loop. So it is only increasing the productivity of the employees. Another area that is very exciting for us is on the data and technology side. Obviously, the first use case that you see here around writing code, debugging code, and all of those things has been pretty much commoditized right now. You have solutions like GitHub Copilot, Code Whisperer, and there are other technologies. You know, depending upon your comfort level, you can use solutions where your code leaves your ecosystem, or you can use solutions that is within, within your firewall. So there are a lot of commodity options that's available. But then there are other exciting opportunities around metadata management and master data management, where GenAI can play a huge role. And last but not the least, I think almost all organizations spend an enormous amount of resources when it comes to data and analytics. So driving any efficiency there is going to be huge savings for any organization. And we see a lot of potential here in being able to have a natural language GenAI overlay on top of all the tables that are used for reporting, and be able to provide the end user a way to quickly extract insights from these tables. So we see a wide range of use cases, not that we are working on all of these use cases simultaneously, and that's important. So this has to go through the lens of a prioritization mechanism, which is what I'd like to discuss a little bit in my next slide. So when we look at any of the use cases, all use cases come with its own level of risk and complexity, as well as we have to look at the feasibility and value. So when it comes to feasibility and value, it's largely driven by the business partners. They have to be able to see upfront if a business problem can be solved with GenAI, will it actually generate value for them? And they'll have to look at the feasibility aspect of it. What I mean by that is, even if the model is successful, it may still have to be integrated into a front-end system. The business partners should have the commitment to put the resources to do some level of curation, which, by the way, pretty much all use cases will definitely need human curation. So they'll have to commit to those resources. But when you look at just the risk and complexity aspect of it, I have this diagram on the left, where I think these two dimensions of data sensitivity and exposure is what we think would be a very logical place to start in terms of deciding which kind of use cases you want to actually start exploring. It seems to us that staying in that the green box area might be the most prudent approach in terms of bringing this technology internally to your organization to try out on various use cases. So basically, these will be use cases where you're either working on public data, it could be your website data and things like that, or internal non-sensitive data. And what I mean by internal non-sensitive data is if your client is able to create a login to your company, and once they are able to log in, then they have access to certain documents that may not be considered as public, but it's not sensitive. So those might be some of the areas where you can explore. And certainly, as we bring in this technology, it makes sense to initially explore use cases that are completely internal facing to internal employees, which is the sort of strategy that we are following. And again, this the green box that I show here is mainly around commercial models, like if you're planning to use ChatGPT. But if you're using open source models, like the Lambda or other things that you can actually download and actually pre-train, then of course, then this green box can expand even further, and you might be able to include more data because there are clear approaches for detoxing external, like downloadable models and pre-training with your data. So that's one. So another aspect of the complexity is you're going to find use cases, especially the ones that are transformative. Those use cases are not going to be something that you can accomplish with just a single model. Usually it will be a combination of models, Gen AI, as well as traditional AI models, along with other things. So it's an ecosystem of different models that have to come together, and that has to be properly orchestrated. So just simply working on one aspect of it may not deliver the value that you're really looking at from a Gen AI standpoint. So having that perspective upfront can help prioritize some of these use cases. And the third one that I have here is reusable designs. And this is very important when you want to actually scale the use cases. If you're able to work on use cases where you can actually come up, when you work on the use cases, we are able to extract some reusable patterns, then that can help the next use case have a really great jump start. So that seems to be a very logical strategy. So whenever you see use cases that can actually lend itself naturally to creating these reusable patterns, they should potentially take a higher priority. And last but not the least, there has to be a process that can closely look at legal compliance and risk aspects of every use case and be able to disposition these use cases quickly so that the use cases can be experimented with. So moving on, so I just want to spend just a few minutes on this knowledge management use case. Again, I just want to define what I mean by knowledge management. Knowledge management are a class of use cases where you have a knowledge base and somebody is asking a question or a prompt, and you want to be able to extract the right answer from that. And what is considered as a right answer and things like that, that can have a lot of variations depending upon the use case. But broadly speaking, that is the goal of knowledge management. And large language models, which is a type of generative AI models focusing only on language, is a really good candidate to sort of use for this use case. Large language models are developed using a lot of publicly available data. You can also use proprietary data in case you're using an open source model. And the objective of large language models, the fundamental objective, is to really get great at cognitive computing capabilities, right? Really become great at natural language understanding and generation. But because of the fact that it is operating on a lot of data that you see on the left, it is going to have world knowledge as well. So when it comes to highly regulated industries like banks and asset management, it's important for us to be able to somehow leverage the power of the language understanding, but be able to somehow mitigate the risks from the world knowledge, things like hallucination, bias, and things like that. So that leads to two key questions that every organization that wants to scale knowledge management has to accomplish. The first one is how can we restrict the answer or response that you get from the system to just the approved text. So the approved text is the knowledge base that you're comfortable with, right? The answers should be absolutely contained within that. And this is a well-solved problem just in terms of the technique. It's called grounding or knowledge augmentation. And then you add additional prompt engineering, and this can be accomplished. But there are a lot of variations one has to really consider along the way. The second one is, now that you have an answer, you still have to ensure that it is consistent. If two people ask the same question, you cannot have a situation where one person feels that some information, key information is missing, the other person feels that some other information is missing, right? How do you ensure that some of the key aspects of that answer is always maintained for all the answers, even if the way the answer is actually generated could be different from a language standpoint. The second one is around accuracy and completeness. All of these things have to be tackled. But there are other situations where you actually want the answers to be different. For instance, if somebody is asking about a 401k distribution, and the previous conversation the client is having with your frontline worker is around the tax, then when you ask this question, it has to be related to tax. What is the tax implication of 401k distribution? You should understand that. So it's not that it has to always be consistent. So how do you actually create a system that understands all of these variations? It's a pretty complex problem, and it has to be very well thought out before you can scale it to everyone in the organization. I want to briefly talk about this architecture that can support this. So at a high level, there are three parts to this architecture. The first one is before you really do Gen AI, you have to really focus on Gen IA, which is information architecture. You have to make sure that your knowledge base is clean. It doesn't have contradictory information. The model can get heavily confused because of that. And that requires a lot of standard work, just like any other AI ML model. Then comes the representation itself. So these have to be represented as vectors. There are many different ways in which you can do this. You can use a commercial model like ADA model from OpenAI to do the embeddings. You can also create embeddings with your own model. And sometimes you can use both. And these things will greatly enrich the search experience. So that's the information architecture piece. Then comes the human curator. You need an expert curator who can look at a golden data set of questions and be able to send those questions to the system and get the answer, curate that answer, and then you have to further store that answer back into the vector database. So, and that can take time to be able to do it properly. Then the last part is the fine-tuning part, and this can actually be quite a challenging step. It has to be done in a very methodical manner so that you can ensure consistency, completeness, and accuracy, but also account for variations where it actually matters. So these are the three things, and the job will not be done there. You still have to think about an iterative step. You have to have a feedback loop that goes back to the curator, and there is an iterative step which I have not shown here. You also have to keep updating your information architecture so that it is updated. So all of these things have to be set up before any knowledge management use case can really be rolled out more broadly in the organization. But once you do that, you will have a really good reusable pattern that can be almost lift and shifted to other use cases as well. I know I have run out of time, so I'll just maybe point out all four of these things are very important from a Gen AI standpoint. But if I have to pick one, I would say that Gen AI clearly has huge potential, but you can only realize that potential through a lot of rapid experimentation. So ChatGPT has been great in terms of democratizing the solution to non-AML practitioners, but just the downside of it is it has given an impression that it's a lift and shift, that you can throw any data into ChatGPT, from call transcripts to the methodology documents, and you can get a great answer. That is, unfortunately, that is not true. There's a lot of hard work that one has to do to actually enable some of these solutions, even if you use some of the commercial large language models. Thank you.